Throughout our lives, we encounter messy situations, and if you have kids, you know this. In fact, there's a whole category of videos, you just plug in on YouTube, of parents that, they catch their kids in the act of some sort of mess. And it typically begins with a parent saying something like, the kids have been too quiet for a minute. Let me go see what they're doing, what they're up to. In this one video, a parent came downstairs to their kitchen. They found jars of Nutella just opened, and Nutella's all over the place. The cabinets, the kids, the floor, everywhere. Another parent heard a commotion in her pantry, opened the door, found her kids dumped all the flour out. They're just having their own kind of snow day in there, rolling around in it. And perhaps my favorite is when a mom discovered her 3-year-old daughter and 1-year-old son just calmly sitting on the dining room table. And on that table, the daughter had used an entire jar of peanut butter, just painting her brother all over, head to toe. And for us, for me, watching those videos, it's hilarious, right? And I credit these parents who film them because they also find it funny. They seem to handle it pretty well. But how many of us, if we walked into that scene, would have different reactions than laughter? What would you feel in that moment as you just come in and you witness this mess? I can tell you, as someone who has experienced a mess or two in my own house, that I've experienced frustration and anger and dread. So many things can go through our heads when we walk in on that situation. Why did they do this? I was only gone for a minute. Are they going to help me clean it up? Am I going to have to clean it up all by myself? Now, let me ask you this. How do you feel when it's not the kids who caused the mess, but it's your fault? You caused the mess. When kids do messes, right, they can be done to us on some level. But when we make the mess, what goes through our mind? As we get older, something we realize is that kids are not the only ones who make messes, right? And the messes that adults can make can be far worse than a kid armed with peanut butter could do. And there's reasons for this. As people, we can be prideful, foolish, selfish, much more. In a word, it's our sin. It's our sin that makes these messes. It's when we, for example, cave to our flesh and we say, all right, just this once, and then we form a harmful habit. It's when we attempt to project piety, right? We have this mask, but in private, we're no different from the world. It's when we convince ourselves that things like lying, gossip, envy, they're not that bad, and so we make no attempts to address them. See, sin has the potential not only to create messy situations, but to make them a lot worse, like trying to wash your clothes with dirty engine oil. Things are not getting better. Things are only going to get messier. If you open up to the first pages of the book of Isaiah, what you find is that Judah is in a mess of their own making. Sin has snowballed in God's people, and God has noticed. And God, being holy, cannot let them live without consequence because God told them exactly what he expected of them and exactly what was going to happen if they disobeyed. And they did. And so Isaiah is sent to them by God to communicate God's message and tell them God is going to use other nations to judge you, his own nation. That's messy. And yet, despite the judgment God's people will face, God provides them glimmers of hope. Yes, his people are going to be beat down, that they are not going to be buried. God assures them that someone is going to come and to make things right. It's a promise. And it's a promise that we still need today. We need this promise because, like Judah, we still make messes. Yes? We still make messes. And we need this promise because the world has been messed up since the garden. And since then, the corruption of the world has meant we continue to experience sickness, death, and destruction. But as Isaiah describes to us, God's people can have hope because God promises a person, a unique king who will also reign over a unique kingdom. And such a promise is intended for us to grasp, to hold on to, especially in hard times. Which brings me to, this is the one thing I want you to remember today. All right, when life gets messy, fix your hope on the root of Jesse. When life gets messy, fix your hope on the root of Jesse. Okay, if you don't remember anything else, remember this. When life gets messy, fix your hope on the root of Jesse. Now, let's look at Isaiah and see why this root of Jesse is the one you ought to place all your hope in. And towards that end, we're going to take this passage in two parts. Let me go ahead and read Isaiah 11 for you. Turn in your Bibles, please, to Isaiah chapter 11. And we're going to look at the first 10 verses of Isaiah 11. There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, and the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide disputes by what his ears hear, but with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt of his waist, and faithfulness the belt of his loins. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the lion and the fattened calf together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the cobra, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the adder's den. They shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. In that day, the root of Jesse, who shall stand as a signal for the peoples, of him shall the nations inquire, and his resting place shall be glorious. So, it's an amazing promise. We're going to take this in two parts. First, we're going to consider the kind of king that this king is. First 5 verses, the kind of king that he is. And then second, we're going to consider the kind of kingdom that this king reigns over. So roughly verses 1 to 5 and then 6 to 9. All right, but before we get into it, we need to back up a few verses because before chapter 11, God has already been chopping it up, so to speak. And so we look back and we see in chapter 10, I'll read a few verses for you. In verses 24 and 25 of chapter 10, we read, O my people who dwell in Zion, be not afraid of the Assyrians when they strike with the rod and lift up their staff against you, as the Egyptians did. For in a very little while my fury will come to an end, and my anger will be directed to their destruction. So here's the basic message. Chapter 10, he's telling his people, don't be afraid. Just as they struck you, I'm going to strike them. But it's more than that. It doesn't just end there. This is not a simple tit for tat. When God deals with Assyria, it will not be a slap on the wrist. Listen to the final words of chapter 10, verses 33 and 34. Look, the Lord God of armies will chop off the branches with terrifying power, and the tall trees will be cut down, and the high trees felled. He is clearing the thickest of the forest with an axe, and Lebanon with its majesty will fall. Assyria, this nation that will be used by God to judge his people, will also face God's judgment. In describing Assyria as this great forest, this imagery is striking. God is going to cut them down. And when God is finished, this one great forest will be a wasteland. So chapter 10, God tells them, Assyria's coming, and they're going to cut you down, but don't think I'm sparing them. I'm going to cut them down too. Now, when we get to chapter 11, we see a contrast. The difference in light of chapter 11 is that every earthly dynasty will be left with dead stumps, but not God's people. Not God's people. Look at verse 1 again. There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. To state the obvious, if you're walking, you think about the trails you've been on. If you're walking through the forest and come across a stump with a clean cut, what do you conclude? Someone came and cut this tree down. Destruction has taken place. In the same way, to talk about a stump of Jesse is to recognize, there was a tree here. But what we're left with, what we're looking at is a stump. The imagery reminds us judgment is coming for Judah. But remarkably, not only does this tree survive, it's not just a couple of leaves, it thrives, it's bearing fruit. Okay, so don't miss this. Verse 1, God is preparing his people to see that through destruction, life will come. through destruction, life's going to persist. Sound familiar? All right, this is a pattern that God will use in the Bible over and over again. So hold on to this. Also in chapter 11, as we open, we got to ask ourselves, who's Jesse? Who's Jesse? What's the big deal with Jesse? And to answer this, just want to read the last verses of this beautiful little book of Ruth. This is how the book of Ruth ends with a genealogy, verse 21 of chapter 4. Salmon fathered Boaz, Boaz fathered Obed, Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. And it was David who God made a covenant with, telling him, I will, quote, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Forever. The shoot of Jesse is none other than the promised king. This promise that God made to David. So to invoke the name of Jesse is to invoke the covenant promise God makes to David, a king to come who will reign forever, which is rather significant to these people. Remember, Judah, Israel, they're in a messy situation. They are being cut down because of their sin. And especially in the midst of affliction, you could very easily picture Israelites asking themselves, is this the end? Is this the end? Or as one scholar put it, will the Lord keep his promises? God said we'd have a king and a kingdom, but feels like we're finished right now. And verse 1 begins to answer this. It's God's answer to them. God knows what's going to happen. And he sends Isaiah to communicate to them, to say to them, hey, you are going to face hard times. But don't conclude that just because you're facing hard times that I'm being unfaithful to you. It's the opposite. You, Judah, are facing hard times because you've been unfaithful to me. But God in his kindness, knowing that his discouraged people might loosen their grip on God-given promises, intentionally doubles down on the promise. God's promise of a Davidic king remains. That's verse 1, and it's good news to his people, a discouraged people. And all that helps us understand the kind of king he is. It's not just any king belonging to any family. This is the promised Davidic king. That's verse 1. Okay, verses 2 through 5, we're going to move a little more fast. We continue to see the kind of king this is, namely, and we'll see this, his relation to God and then his relation to others as well. So verse 2, it says, the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him. And in the Old Testament, there's many instances of the Spirit falling and indwelling people for a time, for a specific purpose. But there are only 3 people in the Old Testament who receive a permanent Spirit indwelling. That's Moses, Joshua, and David. And Isaiah here tells us, there's going to come another. There will come another. Only this one to come is in many ways better than Moses, Joshua, or David. In 3 ways, right? You read in verse 2, he will have God's wisdom and understanding. He will have God's counsel and might and God's knowledge. Now, these are qualities of a man that are unique to him and no one else in the Old Testament. No such descriptions were given to Moses, Joshua, and David, not all of them at least. And continuing into verse 3, we see that this king delights in God. Specifically, quote, his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. This man will have respect for the Lord, reverence for God, unlike God's people. This king is not going to go his own way. And if you've read the wisdom literature of the Old Testament, specifically Proverbs, one of the fundamentals about wisdom is fear of the Lord. It's one of the main marks of someone who is in right relationship with God. As one author puts it, to fear God is to know him, and to know him is to fear him. They go hand in hand. And this king, fearing the Lord to him isn't merely a duty, it's a delight. It's a delight. So verses 2 to 3, they describe his relation to God. He is godly, unlike anyone else before. And now the second aspect of the king, his relation to others. It goes without saying, but people of authority, they have to wield authority. And a metric of whether or not someone's a good leader is how they handle that authority. Verses 3 to 5 describes someone who rules with the utmost integrity. He acts with righteousness and equity. Look at verse 5 specifically. Righteousness shall be the belt of his waist, and faithfulness the belt of his loins. One scholar says these characteristics are the king's most intimate garments, his underclothing. When you strip everything else away, this is what you find about this king. These are his core characteristics. And again, people who are living under hard times, Judah, brought about in part by imperfect kings, this is good news. Think about it like this. How many of you have had the unfortunate experience of working under a bad boss? Just like raise your hand. Anyone had that before? All right. Having a bad boss might mean a lot of things. It might mean you end up with more work, right? It might mean workplace conflicts, they don't get resolved. It might mean working without feeling like you have a purpose, not having confidence. Or perhaps it means that office culture is just, it's toxic, it's bad. Where there's gossiping, or worse, that promotions basically boil down to, who's the boss's favorite. Okay, having a bad boss can mean a whole bunch of bad consequences. In the very first verse of Isaiah, we read that the prophet received visions concerning the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. And of that list, Ahaz definitely was the worst, and Hezekiah was the best. But they were all imperfect, and none of them were the promised Davidic king. So as God's people read the descriptions of the coming king, they could compare and contrast with the kings that they've had and experienced. A king who would rule over them in a perfect way. Now, this is jumping ahead of a bit, but look at verse 10 now. Before we get there, just a word of context. In the Old Testament, there's different stages in the life of God's people. There was a time where there was one king, one kingdom, one Israel. But again, because of sin, the kingdom splinters in half. And you have Israel in the north, Judah in the south. And God, being kind, sends prophets to each of them, Isaiah being one. Now, everything we've discussed so far in Isaiah's day is most relevant for Judah, those in the south. But when we get to verse 10, Isaiah confirms to us that this king, he's going to matter for the world, not just Judah, the world. All right, verse 10, in that day, the root of Jesse, who shall stand as a signal for the peoples, of him shall the nations inquire, and his resting place shall be glorious. So a day is coming when the king will come, and when he does, he's going to set up a home, and like a magnet, all the other nations are coming. They're going to be drawn to him. A time when every people on earth will be united under a single king. Again, a promise of a future that is significant to a people who have only known a divided kingdom. So to summarize, verse 5 and verse 10, they help us get a sense of the kind of king that is coming. The perfect king, the one who's going to unite all people, all the world. A king that gives his people hope. Let me illustrate it this way of what Isaiah is doing. Imagine a group of people who suffer from the same illness, and over the years, this group has had many doctors visit them, and with varying degrees of success. At times they're improving their health, but at other times they're making them worse. Now imagine that these people get word that, hey, a new doctor's coming. And hearing this, they ask for proof. And the nurse tells them, hey, I can't tell you who he is yet, but I've been told of his credentials, I've been told of his references, I've been told of his research, and he is exactly the right man to help you. And compared to all the other doctors, he is just orders of magnitudes greater than the rest you've experienced. That would create some hope in those patients, wouldn't it? And in a similar way, Isaiah is describing to a discouraged people that the king to come is greater than any that they've known, just greater than any they know. The right man for the job is on the way. And God, by doing so, is giving his people hope. And today, the promised shoot of Jesse remains our hope in hard times. Here's my first point to you. Perhaps you've seen already, the king is coming, hope in him. It's very simple. The king is coming, hope in him. Now, these verses, they're not just interesting phrases to be studied. They aren't just for Judah. We need them. You and I need these words too. Every single one of us plans for the future on some level. Christian, non-Christian, religious, irreligious, all of us to some degree have desires and longings for how our lives is going to turn out. If you put it theologically, every person has an eschatology, right? Some sort of future goal, some sort of future existence that we hope for. But eschatologies are not all equal. Whatever plans you make for your life, However we conceptualize our future, if it doesn't include the root of Jesse, then our futures are fragile. All right, you remove the root of Jesse, you remove this king, your future becomes fragile. The only security of a future comes with this king. If our ultimate hope is dependent on the future plans and promises we make for ourselves, we are setting ourselves up for deep disappointment. Consider this as an example. It's not uncommon to hear advice which appeals to the future to encourage people in the present. It can go something like this. As a child, you're told to focus on your studies. And although it can be difficult, the future hope we tell our students is it's all worth it because they will get in a good school. They will get good scholarships. And then once they're in school and things get hard, what do we tell them? We tell them to endure because there's a future hope that once you graduate, you'll get that good job, that their education will grant them better opportunities. And then once they're in that good job and they have difficulty, what do we tell them? We might encourage them to endure because an even better job will come along, some better experience. Maybe they could retire early, whatever it is. The danger with this is if someone follows this advice and it doesn't pan out, they could feel completely defeated, right? If that's their ultimate hope. Lord knows there's many students who have unfortunately questioned their self-worth, their purpose, when this path that they were given didn't pan out, when the promise didn't come through. So planning for the future is not wrong. We need to plan for the future. But placing all our hope in future plans is wrong because nothing we pre-arrange for ourselves is guaranteed. This is something that another smaller book in the Bible, James, reminds us. He says in his book, "You do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that." So here's my point. There's always a risk in placing our hope in man-made futures. There's a risk there. There's no guarantee there. But there is no risk when you place your hope in the promises and plans of God. God's promises are always guaranteed. If God said and told us that the root of Jesse is coming, then he's coming. And friends, we can be absolutely certain that the root of Jesse comes because he's come once already, hasn't he? He's come once already. For Isaiah's readers, they did not know, they could not know. But for us, this is no mystery. The king came once, and as we've sung, his name is Jesus. And don't just take my word for it. When I look at the scriptures here, on the first page of the New Testament, we encounter a remarkable genealogy. Notice how Matthew emphasizes Jesus' relation to David. Verse 1, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. With two names, Matthew has recalled two major covenants, two major promises, one of them being that one between God and David. And as Jesus is born and begins his ministries, many others confirm his ancestry. At one point, Jesus is passing by and a pair of blind men cry out to him saying, "Have mercy on us, son of David." And later, what is known as the triumphal entry, Jesus enters into Jerusalem and is met with praises and people saying, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord." Of course, what folks quickly learn about Jesus is that he's not like other kings. People expected the promised Davidic king to come and to conquer. But Jesus' purpose was incomprehensible to them at that point. As king, he had to die to conquer their true oppressor, which was sin. And that's exactly what he did. And being successful in making atonement for sin, he was raised to the right hand of God, where he has already started to execute his reign. And before Stephen was stoned, the scriptures tell us, Stephen, full of the Holy Spirit, gazed into heaven and saw the glory of God, and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. And he said, "Behold, I see the heavens opened, and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God." But Jesus is not done. He's coming back. And when he does, he'll restore all things, establish his rule and reign in a visible way forever, fulfilling the promise given to David. And if you spend any time in the book of Revelation, then you know of all the things to come: final victory, judgment, peace. And in the final page of that book, Jesus says this, Revelation 22, verse 16, "I, Jesus, have sent my angel to testify to you about these things for the churches. I am the root and the descendant of David, the bright morning star. So even as the New Testament closes, there is no doubt as to who this root of Jesse is. It's Jesus, and he's coming back. So our point stands. The king is coming, hope in him. The king is coming, hope in him. Now we should all want Jesus to come back because as verses 6-9 show us, the kind of kingdom Jesus will establish is unlike anything we know right now. Right now, we know pain, we know suffering, we know turmoil, it's messy, but when the root of Jesse returns, the whole world will be transformed. Look at verses 6-9 again. The wolf, and as I read this, just try and picture this, okay? Verse 6, the wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the lion and the fattened calf together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the cobra, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the adder's den. They shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters covers the sea. This passage describes a new world, a transformed world. A couple observations for you here. First, animals. They're described as having new natures, right? Verse 7, the cow and the bear shall graze, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. Bears and lions will behave differently. Second, the passage is striking because it's repeated mention of children. Verse 6 is quite the image. How did you picture this one? The wolf dwell with the lamb, leopard with the goat, calf and the lion, and a child leading them. Seems ridiculous to us. Predator and prey together being led by a child. If you were going to conceive of a messy, dangerous situation, this may very well be something you come up with. This image right here, verse 6. How panicked would you be if you learned that on the day your kid goes to the zoo, that all the animals are let loose? Like you would freak out. I would freak out. But in this new kingdom, in this transformed world, the children are free to play because there is no danger. And to stress this all the more, Isaiah includes verse 8. Children will play over the hole of the cobra and put their hands in the adder's den, adder being, another word for snake. And let me ask you this. Can you remember another time Scripture talks about snakes and kids? Any references come to mind? I think of Genesis 3, some of the first pages of the whole Bible, where the curse is given to the serpent and the curse between the serpent and the offspring of the woman. And one scholar suggests that Isaiah alludes to that curse to point out that in this new kingdom, the curse is lifted. And when Jesus completely establishes his kingdom, snakes won't pose any danger to kids. Predators won't pose a danger to anyone. It's God's way of illustrating a world where pain and death don't exist. It's no longer. And it's a world that all of us should long for. And the final striking quality, verse 9, it's almost a explanation for why this world is the way that it is. Isaiah says, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. The Lord is the reason the world is transformed. A transformation not only of a slice of land, right, for a certain group of people, it's a transformation that impacts every living creature. The knowledge of the Lord will be cosmically comprehended, and that is something to look forward to. This entire picture that Isaiah provides, again, is given to provide some hope. Hope in the King who will bring this new world, because it is only through the King that the new world will come. Over the years, there's been, I think, countless attempts to bring about a sort of heaven on earth. Yes? From philosophers to politicians, humanity has never lacked visionaries who promise utopia. All of them assert on some level, hey, if you just follow me, you follow my plan, we will arrive at paradise. But every single one of those has failed, hasn't it? But in light of Isaiah, we can conclude that every attempt to construct a future apart from the King, again, right, no matter how complex, no matter how popular it is, All such attempts are tantamount to putting the cart before the horse. You can't do this without this king. This sort of transformed world is not going to happen without him. There's no lasting hope apart from the king. A world that knows nothing of sickness, death, and violence is not a world that any one person or society or country can bring about. Again, I think we're touching on something that all of us should care about. Okay, think for yourself, rhetorical questions, but do you experience hurt or destruction? Have you felt that pain? Have you faced difficulty? Have you fallen prey to sin in this life? Then you and I, yes, we should hope for this king and this kingdom all the more. Every one of us has a list of afflictions we've experienced due to sin, a list that includes not only the consequences of our own sin, but also the difficulties of just living in a fallen and broken world. So whatever is on your list, and however long that list is, they should move us more to hope in this king. Especially because this list of ours will just keep growing. So every time that you face hardship and you have to add to that list, they are opportunities to remember God's promise to you, to his church. We get to remember that whatever present difficult circumstances we face, they will not be the end. They will not be the end. Again, God understood that when his people faced hard times, they'd be tempted to loosen their grip on God and his promises. So God includes passages like Isaiah 11 so that his people can strengthen their grip on God and his promises, to cling to them all the more. And just as God gave his people promises in the Old Testament, so God continues to give them in the New. And as our brother John reminds us in the last book of the Bible, he gives us one that is so beautiful, right? God will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. That is a world to look forward to. Another promise that you and I can cling to in confidence if we follow the king. Because that is the world that the king is bringing, but that no one else is going to bring. Which brings us to the simple takeaway. My second point for you, his kingdom is coming, hope in the king. His kingdom is coming, hope in the king. All right, before I close, I want to consider one more thing with you. Okay, life is messy. I hope that we have established that together. And as I've tried to point out, it's messy because creation is corrupted by sin. But again, what we have to acknowledge is that just like Judah, you and I have had a part in making the mess, right? But consider how this tells us something of God. Was God's promise ever in jeopardy? Or to put it another way, did human hands ever threaten heaven? No. No matter how bad God's people mess up, God's promise is never at risk. Amen? Does that not give you some hope? No matter how bad God's people mess up, God's promise is never at risk. Does that not tell us something of the commitment that God has to his people? Let me go a step further. The root of Jesse faced hurt and destruction for your mess, for my mess, so that you and I could enter this kingdom where there is neither hurt nor destruction. That is good news, that the root of Jesse came, and he came for us. And it's an invitation, it's a reality that is available to everyone, right? All the nations one day will be united under this king. And the lengths that God will go to preserve his promises are unmatched. The cross demonstrates this. Which brings us just to something I want to say with crystal clarity, that there is no greater hope than Jesus. There is no greater hope than Jesus. This kind of world, again, is not possible by human hands. So for us, we must trust in him, believe in him, hope in him in good times and in hard times. So as we enter 2025, with all of its joys and trials, our focus should remain the same. Focus on Jesus. So I'll leave you with how I began. When life gets messy, fix your hope on the root of Jesse.